Hi, welcome back. So, this is part 2 of the series of 3 presentations on advanced presentation skills. In part 1, we found out a bit about why many of us get presentation nerves. And the answer turns out to be, in fact, that we're human. In this and the next part, it's okay knowing about why you have these feelings, but we'll be looking at ways to deal with them and to avoid the problems in the first place. Okay, so this is part 2, and the batting order or the train journey railway timetable for today is: why are your audience there? Therefore, what are you there for? Something called PET, which we'll talk about in a moment, and then finally the things that you control. As last time, this is a signposting slide. I won't, because this is a very short presentation, I won't reintroduce it, but the model you should have in your head for this type of slide is possibly you're on your way home from work, on the train, and you fall asleep. At some point you wake up and you don't know for a moment quite where you are, whether you've overslept, whether the train has gone past your station, and you look up and you see the signboard. In many countries there's a sort of little board that shows you where you are on the journey. This is that signboard. It's showing you, or shows your audience, what stations you're going to stop at, and it allows them to keep abreast of your structure and to keep plugged into where they're going. Your job is to take your audience on a journey, not some random walk thing that ends up in the middle of nowhere, but on the journey that you intend them to take through the ideas or the thinking or whatever it is that you've prepared for them. So, signposting, always good. Usually in a presentation of any size, this original signposting slide will be shown more than once to remind people of where they are. So, this gig comprises of 2 groups, or 2 parties. One is you, and one is your audience. So we'll start with thinking or asking, why are your audience there? Now, there's probably 4 main reasons why your audience are there, and it depends slightly on, if you like, what the advertising was, what the event is. So, they may have come to be entertained. An example might be an after-dinner speech, or a stand-up comic, or something like that. So, they expect to laugh, but they also expect to learn something. And one of the common denominators here, irrespective of the why people are there, is usually people come for more than one thing, and secondly, all pretty much possibilities include them learning something, which includes you communicating. Anyway, so they may have come to be entertained. They may have come to get an information, some sort of information, a lecture or a briefing. And in that sort of situation, they're still expecting to learn something, but they're expecting to learn quite a lot of things. And if it's very practical, like how to use your vacuum cleaner, quite detailed as well, or quite technical. They may have come to be persuaded. It might be a religious or a political meeting, and they have gone to hear either one side or the other or both sides to whatever situation or story they're interested in. Again, they expect to learn something, but this is slightly different. At some level, they are wanting to believe something, either positive or negative. And the fourth main reason, in inverted commas, is to get out of the rain. It may be that the person is sitting there and they're not one of your students, or they're not one of the people that's been invited. It just happens that they were there and they're a bit interested, so they've sat down. In all of these potential possibilities, it's taken as read that everybody wants clarity about what is being said or what is being argued. And that's almost taken as a given. Okay, if that's why they're there, why are you there? Well, of course, it depends on the why or the purpose of the event or the presentation. But you're there to communicate under all circumstances. You're there to give information in pretty much all circumstances, and of the possible things that you will be required to do, actually, giving information is the easiest thing. It may be a two-way presentation, maybe a marketing type event, where actually, whether it's declared or not, one of the aims is to get information. That's harder, and in the third talk, we'll think a little bit about ways and means here. It may be that you're there to entertain. It may be you're a stand-up comic. That's pretty hard, and I'm not really going to talk more about that. It may be that you are there to persuade. This is extremely difficult, and again, this is not something I'm going to cover. Right, first thing here, focus on one of these only and on clarity. Don't try to get them mixed up. Yes, an occasional joke in a maybe fairly heavy presentation doesn't do any harm, but that's not your focus. And actually, dropping humour here and there is quite an advanced thing to do, because sometimes it goes down like a lead balloon. Okay, now we've covered the why is everybody there. Let's actually introduce you to something called PET. PET is an abbreviation. Purpose, endpoint, time. These are the three things in terms of the delivery and the content that you have to manage. Different purposes have different requirements. Now, we said before that all presentations require communication. Actually, that's something that most people do all the time, and incredibly finessed and nuanced communication. Think about conversations you have with your lover, partner, wife, husband. They're quite nuanced. With friends, with colleagues. It depends on the context, but communication is something that we already are very good at it. We sort of have to be, or else we would murder each other. So basically, you're coming in terms of communication as an expert. It may be that you're unfamiliar with the context, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. So, the type of purposes we've already discussed: information, a briefing, a talk, a lecture, persuasion, or entertainment. Now, depending on which of these is your purpose, that defines your endpoint. After you have done whatever it is you're going to do, the endpoint is where you want your audience. You want them informed, and if it's a teaching or a briefing talk, maybe a technical briefing, how their washing machine works or whatever in some detail. If it's entertainment, you want them happy, you want them laughing, preferably with broken ribs, so that they've been entertained. Or if you're trying to persuade, you want new customers or true believers or whatever it is that that meeting is about. However, the end point also determines the mode of your presentation. Purpose and end point determine how you are going to present something. So the way that you might present a scientific presentation is almost certainly not the way you would present maybe a religious sermon or evangelical proselytizing address. The reason you're doing something, the purpose, determines the end point and the how you do it. And again, we'll talk about some of these a little bit later. And finally, time. How long have you got? Well, if you go back to our complete proposal, you've got 30 minutes. So there is no virtue in going over 30 minutes. Your aim is to finish within 30 minutes. If you go over, it's almost certainly counterproductive for reasons that will become apparent in the next part. So we know why everybody's there. We know what our purpose, our end point, and our time is. So to achieve this, what can you control? Well, it turns out you control quite a lot. You control the structure of your talk. You control what goes in it, the content. You control the timing. You control the style or the ambience of this session. You control the room layout. Or if you don't control the room layout, it will control you. And one of the golden rules of life is you want to be controlling events in a situation like this. The moment that events begin to control you, the event spirals out of control. If you're part of a team, you control the team. And you control the roles that you occupy. This is tons. This is easily enough to produce something which is effective, not perfect. Do not go for perfect, ever. It's a fool's game. It can produce something which is effective in meeting your aims every time. So, let's now look at these things that you control in more detail in the context of the presentation itself. The room, the layout, the venue. One of the things to think about here is, I've no idea who you are watching this. I'm hoping sincerely that you all at some point in your lives have been to see a gig or a band, and you sort of notice that each concert or gig you go to is different. The set's different. It's been set up differently according to what the objectives of that band is. So you go to a presentation, you're wanting to do an interactive session, and the venue is a lecture theatre. Non-starter. You won't be able to do what you want effectively unless your room is laid out to help. So if you want to do an interactive session, you need tables with groups around it, or however you're going to deal with it. What you don't want is a giant barn of a lecture theatre where it's very difficult for people to move around. So, room layout first. If you can't control it, you do your homework in advance and you realise that actually there's no chance you're lumbered with a giant lecture theatre. Therefore, you have to think quite carefully how you're going to do your interaction. It won't be people walking around tables and joining other groups. It might be that you need to use phone app communication live in the lecture, and I'll talk about that in part 3. The content. Well, that depends on your preparation. We'll talk about structure in a moment. All I'll say now is lack of preparation is basically setting yourself up to fail. So you need to know your content and you need to prepare, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later. The style and the ambience, these are things that you set. It doesn't matter what your subject is. I've been to lectures on things like quantum mechanics, for instance, which have actually driven me to sleep. I've been to other presentations where, oh my goodness me, I was completely energized. You control this. If you wish to speak in a monotone the whole time, not making eye contact with your audience and reading your slides one after the other, guarantee they will catch up on their sleep. The same session delivered properly and potentially with certain understandings plumbed into your slides, the style of the slides and how you run the session, can keep not only people awake, but people engaged. And we'll talk about that a lot in the final session. The team. There's no point having 5 of you or 3 of you as a team if all the team do is sit in the audience and cheer you on. It's good if they do, but that will be wasting an opportunity. Organise your team to facilitate your outcomes. Your team are vital in your preparation. And basically, if you can't think of anything for your team to do to help you to prepare, then it's you that's not prepared. You haven't thought out clearly enough what you're doing and what you want to achieve. And so what we'll look at now, the other things that you control, the timing, the roles, and the structure. The structure is usually standard, is I don't like to use that word, but yes, it's broadly what's called the ham sandwich structure or something like that. Basically, the meat, the content, or the vegetables, if you're a vegetarian, are in the middle, along with the questions and discussion. And those two parts together are the core of your presentation. Around the edge, the bread if you like, you've got the welcome and the introduction, and they've got thank you, goodbye and go home bit at the end. So they're the 2 bits of bread. Now, to have a sandwich, you need all of these things, and they're all important. And to make your presentation work best, you have to think about why each of these are important and how you're going to do it. Now, you remember earlier we talked about the idea that of roles in a train or an aircraft and roles in a presentation, and we said, okay, we'll assume for now there are just 2 roles. In fact, there are a number of roles. Roles that you probably have to adopt in most presentations, and the objectives of each role are different. So let's actually look at what the roles you need to adopt are. First of all, there is the top of the sandwich, the welcome and introduction. Now, maybe there'll be somebody to introduce you and say, this is Professor Bloggs, blah, blah, blah. Great. But most presentations, actually, you have to do that. Now, this introduction part, you need to adopt 2 roles. The Master of Ceremonies, which is if there's a fire alarm, you need to go out via the left, whatever. And then the chair, who is the person that keeps order and keeps things running on time. If it's you, you have to do both of these things. From fire alarms to I'll take questions at the end. Something like that. You might think this is unimportant. If you get this wrong, then your audience go into your presentation uncertain. And that's not where you want your audience to be. That's not the journey you want to take your audience on. Okay, then comes the content. And now you switch gear. You're no longer the chair or the master of ceremonies. You are the subject expert. You're talking, for instance, about the energetics of applied synchronized swimming. I made that up. And you are the world expert or the expert in this room on that subject. We'll talk more about that in the next part. Then the content comes to an end and it's time for questions and discussion. Don't believe that the content is the entirety of the talk. Look at the time here. Questions are more important, or at least as important, as the content, because the questions and discussion are the things that test what you've been saying, and together they form the talk. Now, in terms of the roles you occupy, you go back to being the master of ceremonies and the chair. So you'll be, for instance, people will be hopefully putting their hand up, wanting to ask questions, and you may have a master of ceremonies, you might not. So you'll be actually answering questions, so you're being the master of ceremonies and the chair. Then you switch to subject expert to answer the question. Now, it may be that, and very often this happens, people in the audience, that they get a question like half born. It's almost there and you're not quite sure. So also, you have to act as a facilitator to work with the questioner to get their question out there so that everybody can see it. And very often, and we'll talk about this in the last part of these talks, very often you'll start your answer to every question by saying something like, okay, I understand your question to be, and then answer it. Okay, hopefully that goes all well. And now you are pretty much at the end of the talk. You again take up the role of master of ceremonies and chair. You thank people for being there. You applaud the speaker. And I guess if you're the speaker, you applaud the audience. And then you say goodbye. Time to go home, sort of thing. This is a good workhorse structure, but understand the different roles that you need to adopt to make it a success. This last part usually includes making sure that people have your contact details and things like that. Okay, I think probably I've said all I want to about the talk. What I want to do in the final part is to give you the tools to make this work for you. You need effective, you don't need perfect, and you can all do a perfectly effective talk. You need to prevent your reptilian protector triggering certain things, and you need actually to understand where your audience are coming from and things like their attention span and things like that. But that's the next session. Thanks for listening. Take care. Bye bye.